Margaret Johnson always believed her family's polished exterior hid deeper cracks, growing up in suburban Chicago, where manicured lawns stretched in every direction and neighbors exchanged polite nods. She felt the tension beneath the Johnson household's picture-perfect facade. Her parents, George and Barbara Johnson, showered her younger brother, Edward, with praise for even the smallest accomplishments he scraped by with passing grades. Yet he was rewarded with new gadgets and unwavering approval. Meanwhile, Margaret worked after school shifts at the local diner, saving every dollar toward college, only to be met with her mother's lukewarm, "That's nice," and her father's sigh of relief when she didn't disappoint. By the time Margaret earned a scholarship to study design at a prestigious university, she had mastered the art of self-reliance. She learned that emotional support was a luxury she couldn't afford, so she became fiercely independent, burying her disappointment behind a determined smile. Little did she know that the same dynamics of favoritism and neglect that shaped her childhood would resurface years later, forcing her to confront the painful truth family loyalty can be a weapon as easily as it is a refuge. And when her 8-year-old son, Timothy, was abandoned at a church by the very people who should have protected him, Margaret realized that her past struggles were only the prologue to an ordeal that would test her resilience and redefine the meaning of family. After her husband David's tragic death on a construction site due to a catastrophic structural failure, Margaret Johnson found herself suddenly responsible for raising their 8-year-old son, Timothy, entirely on her own, overnight. The life she had carefully built with her husband, one filled with shared dreams, laughter, and the comfort of knowing they could rely on each other, crumbled into a haze of grief and uncertainty. In the weeks following the accident, Margaret threw herself into both mourning and managing their small graphic design studio, determined to provide stability for Timothy. She often worked 16-hour days, balancing client deadlines with bedtime kisses, even when her heart ached to simply collapse on the couch and cry. The local community rallied around them in the immediate aftermath. Neighbors brought casseroles. Timothy's teacher sent along coloring books to keep his mind occupied, and a close friend volunteered to drive him to school. But none of this replaced the support she desperately needed from her own parents, George and Barbara Johnson, Margaret's parents, now retired and living only a few miles away, seemed to offer help in theory, but in practice remained emotionally distant. They appeared at holiday dinners and occasionally babysat when convenience outweighed inconvenience. But their affection came with unspoken conditions. "We're worried about your brother," Edward, her mother, Barbara, would say in an offhand way, usually while discussing Edward's latest get-rich-quick scheme rather than asking how Margaret was coping with widowhood. Edward had dropped out of yet another college program, promising he would find his calling in real estate or a tech startup. And each time he failed, whether it was a short-lived food truck or an app that never launched, Margaret's parents quietly slipped him thousands of dollars just to get back on his feet. Every dollar they spent bailing Edward out seemed to be a dollar they were unwilling to invest in Margaret's well-being. When she suggested hiring a part-time nanny or taking a day off to address her own mental health, her father, George, would simply shake his head and remind her that she had been sensible enough to earn a design scholarship. "You've always been strong," he'd say, as if strong women never needed help. Margaret, accustomed to shouldering responsibility since her childhood, felt a familiar tightening in her chest, a blend of resignation and anger. The graphic design studio her husband had co-founded became both her lifeline and her prison. She worked as if her relentless productivity could keep the crushing weight of loss at bay. Every morning at dawn, she brewed a pot of black coffee, dressed in a crisp blouse and slacks, and answered emails from clients spread across various time zones. By late afternoon, she did the school run, dropping Timothy off at St. Mary's Elementary, then returned to her home office to finalize logos or layout pages, always with one eye on the clock, fearing that if she paused, the delicate balance she maintained for her son's sake might collapse, while she juggled invoices, software updates, and customer feedback. Timothy settled into a new routine, watching cartoons quietly at 7 a.m., returning home to an empty house at 3 p.m., and waiting patiently until Margaret's knock on the front door signaled bedtime stories and homemade macaroni, his favorite comfort food. Margaret's parents watched this all unfold with a kind of dismissive concern. When Margaret mentioned that Timothy had started having nightmares, images of his father falling from beams, and the sound of sirens, her mother suggested he might just be going through a phase, never acknowledging that Timothy had witnessed the aftermath of his father's accident firsthand. Meanwhile, the Johnsons continued to funnel money into Edward's ill-fated projects, a revolutionary fitness app that never progressed beyond a prototype, a short-lived vineyard investment that went bankrupt, and a misguided venture into flipping run-down houses that left Edward owing more than he had borrowed. Each time Edward called, George and Barbara would open their checkbook, ignoring Margaret's reminders that she had David's life insurance policy dedicated toward Timothy's education and her own efforts to pay down the mortgage. The stark contrast between how George and Barbara treated their children left Margaret feeling painfully alone. A lifetime of striving to meet parental expectations, straight A's, college scholarship, and a thriving business had earned her nothing more than a polite nod, whereas Edward's failures were always met with sympathetic smiles and bank transfers. She resented the way her combined grief and work schedule left her too exhausted to argue back, leaving her to bury her feelings in design mock-ups and color palettes. Late at night, after Timothy had fallen asleep clutching his father's old work glove, Margaret would scroll through old family photos, snapshots of holiday dinners and summer barbecues, searching for any memory that suggested her parents truly cared. But the friendly smiles in those photographs could not mask the insidious favoritism that now defined her family's interactions. As the months passed, Margaret took deliberate steps to protect her son's emotional health. She limited family visits to once a month and insisted that Edward contribute to a college savings fund for Timothy money. Margaret matched from her earnings rather than accept more handouts from her parents. She set clear boundaries: no more financial bailouts for her brother, and no more unquestioned babysitting by grandparents. Whenever George or Barbara protested, Margaret reminded them of the priority: Timothy needs stability, not loan guarantees for Edward. It was a statement that felt as much to herself as to them, reinforcing her resolve to break the cycle of enabling and neglect. Their reaction: narrowed eyes and curt goodbyes, stung. But Margaret knew she could not waver. She refused to let her parents' misguided loyalty to Edward jeopardize her son's future. Through her unwavering determination, Margaret slowly rebuilt a life that centered on Timothy's well-being and her own resilience. She outsourced small design tasks to a trusted freelancer, allowing herself a few hours each week to volunteer at the local senior center, a decision that, at first, felt selfish, but soon reminded her that acceptance and compassion could coexist with strength, though her parents remained spectators from the sidelines, still entangled in Edward's latest folly. Margaret found solace in crafting a new kind of family for Timothy, one founded on genuine support and mutual respect, rather than the conditional love that had dominated her upbringing. In doing so, she honored the memory of David and secured a hopeful path forward for her son, ensuring that their shared loss would not define them, but instead become the catalyst for a more authentic life built on purpose and love. Edward Johnson's unannounced visit came on a drizzly Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day when gray clouds hung low over suburban Chicago, and every drop of rain felt like a quiet warning. Margaret was in her home office, tapping through client revisions for a new logo design. Her 8-year-old son, Timothy, safely at school. She had just finished a half pot of black coffee, her fuel for the long stretch of deadlines ahead, when a knock sounded at the front door. Glancing at the clock, she realized she had barely 20 minutes before her next video conference call. With a sigh, she set aside her sketchpad and answered the door. standing on her porch, shielded by a borrowed umbrella, was her younger brother, Edward, dressed in a jacket that looked far too expensive for someone she knew to be perpetually broke. "Margaret," Edward said, flashing what he thought was his most charming grin. "My favorite sister." "Edward," Margaret replied, stepping aside to let him enter. "You're my only sister. Remember." She closed the door behind him, her eyes already flicking to the clock in the hallway. "Coffee I've got." "I'd love one," he interrupted, brushing raindrops from his collar. He followed her into the kitchen, and though his demeanor was easygoing, Margaret sensed an undercurrent of urgency, an inevitability she had come to dread. Moments later, they sat at the kitchen island. Margaret handed Edward a mug of coffee as he rattled off small talk work. Weather, Timothy's latest school play. But beneath those words, she recognized the familiar pattern of his requests. Every visit meant a new scheme that required her money. She watched him, eyebrows faintly raised, waiting for the reveal. "Margaret," he said, leaning forward and lowering his voice, "I've got an investment opportunity you need to hear about." She braced herself. "Let me guess, another app, or that house-flipping idea you had last year." He shot her a look that balanced hurt and impatience. "No, this is different. Cryptocurrency. It's the future. I've got inside info on a secure coin about to explode. We're talking triple your money in 6 months." He slid his smartphone across the island, displaying colorful charts, projected growth rates, and logos of supposed industry experts who endorsed the venture. Even from a distance, Margaret could see the red flag's anonymous founders, guarantees that defied market logic, and no credible backers. $30,000, he said, clicking a clicker on a PowerPoint slide. "That's my startup capital. I'll pay you back $50,000 by December. Guaranteed." Margaret's heart pounded. She took a deliberate sip of coffee, letting the steam sting a bit. Though Robert's life insurance payout had funded a portion of Timothy's college fund, and her modest graphic design business had stabilized since his passing, she did not have $30,000 to spare, least of all to gamble on what sounded like another one of Edward's perpetual get-rich-quick gambits. "Edward," she said, setting her mug on the counter so firmly that it rattled, "you know I don't have that kind of discretionary cash. And frankly, after all the ventures you've tried, remember the food truck, the vineyard idea, the house flips. Each one crashed, and Mom and Dad bailed you out. I'm not willing to put our son's future on the line for this." His face darkened. "You're the successful one now," he hissed. "The one with the fancy job and the business. It's easy for you to talk about responsibility when you haven't had to risk anything." Margaret straightened in her seat, anger coiling in her chest. "I risk everything for Timothy every single day, emotionally, financially, and practically. I grind so that he has a stable home. You're asking me to gamble on something I've researched, and I see all the warning signs." He slammed his fist on the counter, making the coffee slosh. "Skepticism won't get you anywhere. You're selfish, always the responsible one." "Right. But now you're holding back on family." She rose from her seat, voice steady but firm. "Family helps family. Sure. But family doesn't use shady promises to drain bank accounts. If this is legit, do your own legwork. I'm not your bank." Edward's jaw clenched, nostrils flaring. "Fine. I'll tell Mom and Dad you refuse to help the family. You've always been Dad's favorite daughter. You think you can play the hero. We'll see how that looks to them." Margaret shook her head, feeling a familiar ache. "Do what you have to do. But I know what I know. And I won't let Timothy's well-being be collateral damage for your schemes." Edward stood abruptly, drained by the confrontation. "You're going to regret this," he spat before storming out the door. Margaret exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders, but her relief was short-lived. She knew that the fallout would not stop with her brother. The next day, her phone buzzed with an incoming call from her parents, their voices laced with disappointment and thinly veiled anger. Margaret, how could you turn your back on your brother when he's got a real chance, her mother? Barbara demanded. We've always counted on you to be the reliable one. You're jeopardizing Edward's future. Mom, Margaret replied. Her tone clipped. All I see are red flags. It's a scam. Those kinds of guaranteed returns don't exist. I'm trying to protect him from ruining his life. And I'm trying to protect Timothy's college fund. That money is already spoken for. Her father, George, let out a long sigh. You always think you know better. We're taking out a second mortgage on the house to help Edward. That's what families do. Dad, she said, voice trembling between anger and disbelief. Our home could be on the line for a fraudulent venture. Do you want to risk everything because Edward can't handle rejection? Their lines went dead. Margaret stared at her phone, numb. She realized then that the same familial favoritism that favored Edward over her had reached a dangerous tipping point. That night, as she tucked Timothy into bed and kissed his forehead, she promised herself two things: she would find a way to protect her son from the consequences of her parents' misguided loyalty, and she would stand firm in the face of this toxic dynamic, even if it meant redefining what family truly meant for them. That Tuesday afternoon began like any other. Gray clouds loomed over the neighborhood, and a steady drizzle pattered against Margaret's windshield as she pulled her car into the school parking lot. She checked her watch. 3:10 p.m., 20 minutes before Timothy's dismissal. A familiar knot formed in her stomach. She hated being late. Since David's accident 2 years ago, she made every effort to be the steady anchor in Timothy's life, never missing a pickup or a parent-teacher meeting. Stepping out of the car, umbrella in hand, she trudged toward the front gate, but something felt off. The playground had emptied. The crossing guard was packing up, and still there was no sign of her son. Her heart seized. She hurried inside the main lobby and spotted Mrs. Wilson, Timothy's teacher, standing near the attendance desk. Mrs. Johnson, she called gently, concern etched on her face. Timothy was picked up early today. Margaret's blood ran cold. By whom, she whispered, dread making her voice small. Mrs. Wilson's eyes flicked to an empty hallway. Your parents provided the pickup authorization form at the start of the year. They said it was an emergency. Shocked, Margaret felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She fumbled for her phone, dialing George, her father, first, then Barbara, her mother. Neither answered. Panic surged. How could her parents claim an emergency without even telling her? She thought of her earlier argument with them, their insistence that she bail out Edward one last time, followed by her firm refusal. Could they be retaliating? The thought was unthinkable, yet horrifyingly plausible. She sped home, calling every number she could think of: neighbors, friends, even Ethan's cell. Silence. When she pulled into her driveway, Margaret dashed inside, flinging open the front door. No sign of Timothy. She raced from room to room: living area, kitchen, home office, before collapsing onto the couch, trying to steady her breathing. Each second felt like an eternity. Tears stung her eyes as she dialed 911, her voice trembling as she explained that her son had been taken without her knowledge. 2 hours later, just as dusk settled in, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Mrs. Johnson, a gentle voice asked, "This is Father Michael at St. Augustine Church. We have your son here in our office." Margaret's relief was immediate and overwhelming. She nearly sobbed with gratitude. Within minutes, she sped across town to the brick facade of St. Augustine, entering through the heavy wooden doors. She spotted Timothy seated on a small chair, clutching a stuffed bear, his blue eyes wide with confusion. "Mommy," he cried, jumping into her arms. She hugged him tightly, scanning his face for injuries. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mom and Dad said you didn't want me anymore. They said I had to stay here until you learned your lesson." Shock and fury flared in Margaret's chest. She knelt beside him, smoothing his damp hair. "Oh, sweetie, that's not true. Your grandparents made a terrible mistake. They're confused about grown-up things. None of this is your fault." Father Michael, a kind-faced priest in his mid-50s, gently guided Margaret into a small office nearby. "Your parents left Timothy at the church steps with a backpack and a note. He said he barely understood what was happening, staring at the whitewashed walls." Margaret felt a cold rage building. How could her parents exploit an innocent child to punish her? She steadied herself before calling the police, her voice resolute as she recounted every detail. Officer Diana Murray arrived not long after, her expression somber as Margaret explained the months of tension over Edward's latest investment scheme. When Officer Murray clarified, "So, they essentially kidnapped your son from school and abandoned him at a church as retaliation." Margaret felt the full weight of betrayal. That night, Margaret and Timothy lay together in his bed, the room dimly lit by a small nightlight. Timothy clutched his father's old hard hat, the one he wore to morning coffees before calls to clients. "Mommy, are Grandma and Grandpa going to jail?" he asked, voice trembling. Margaret swallowed hard, pulling him close. "I don't know yet, baby, but I promise you, I will keep you safe. They made a very bad choice. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you." Miranda's mind raced with questions. How long had her parents been planning this? Had they really mortgaged their house to fund Edward's scam? Through sobs, she recalled her father's cold threat. "Family takes care of family. You'll learn your lesson." Now their definition of family meant holding her son hostage, as she held Timothy. She felt something shift inside her, a steel resolve that would not be broken by manipulation or cruelty. In the days that followed, Margaret faced a whirlwind of legal proceedings. She filed charges of child abandonment against her parents, an act that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. Social services interviewed Timothy, ensuring he was safe. Her friends and neighbors rallied around them, offering meals and rides to therapy. Yet nothing could erase the image of her parents turning their backs on their own grandson. She vowed to never let him be collateral damage again. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial strain ever could. Margaret realized that the unconditional love she longed for from George and Barbara was illusory. Family loyalty meant nothing if it condoned cruelty. As she tucked Timothy into bed each night, ensuring his blankets were pulled tight, she whispered a promise they would rebuild their lives on trust and safety, far from the shadow of a conditional love that nearly destroyed them. The morning after Edward's tense visit, Margaret awoke to the soft hum of the city stirring outside her bedroom window. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, illuminating the photographs of her late husband, David, grinning as he held 8-month-old Timothy in his arms. She drew in a steadying breath, steeled herself for another day of balancing deadlines and motherhood. Yet before she could even slide out of bed, her phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand. It was a number she recognized all too well, her parents, George and Barbara Johnson. "Mom, Dad," Margaret answered, bracing herself. "Margaret, how could you refuse to help your brother?" Barbara's voice crackled with reproach, the underlying frustration unraveling her usual pleasant tone. "He showed me those charts. Imagine how you'd feel if the tables were turned." Margaret sat up, tightening the blanket around her shoulders. "Mom, I looked into Secure Coin last night. The so-called founders are anonymous, and they guarantee returns that defy any reasonable market expectation. You know what happened the last time Edward came to you with an opportunity. He's been bailed out 3 times already. Food truck, vineyard, house flips, and each one crashed. I can't, in good conscience, gamble my son's future on another one of his schemes." Barbara's sigh was heavy, dramatic enough to carry through the line. We raised you to be responsible, to stand on your own 2 feet. Yet here you are, hiding behind that business of yours, refusing to support your family. You think you're better than us. Margaret closed her eyes, fighting back a surge of anger. I raised that business with David. I work 12-hour days to provide for Timothy. If I see red flags, I'm going to say so. I don't have $30,000 to spare, especially not when it risks the roof over my head. $30,000. George's voice entered the call, dominant and low. Do you know what families do? Margaret. We're taking a second mortgage on our house to help Edward. That money's gone regardless of what you do. Margaret's heart clenched. She remembered the pride in her father's voice when he first proposed the mortgage. Now she realized the full extent of their desperation. She swallowed hard. Dad, please reconsider. If this is a scam, you could lose everything: your home, your retirement. George cut her off, impatience edging his words. You think you're the expert? You're the one who should reconsider. Fine, if you won't help your brother. Then you're choosing to abandon your responsibilities to this family. And there will be consequences. Margaret's blood ran cold. Consequences, she echoed, voice trembling just slightly. Dad, I'm a widowed mother with a business to run and a mortgage to pay. David's life insurance went into Timothy's college fund. I simply don't have the cash. You know that. Her father's expression must have darkened over the phone. Don't lecture me about priorities. Families stick together. You could have helped him, but you chose to put your son's college money above your own brother. Family helps each other, Margaret said quietly. But it doesn't use shady promises to drain bank accounts. This is different. This is a dangerous gamble. A hard silence followed, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic beyond her bedroom window. Finally, her mother's voice returned, softer but still laced with guilt-tripping undertones. We just want to see Edward succeed. You've always been so distant, so self-reliant. We thought you'd understand. Margaret closed her eyes to hold back tears of frustration. I understand more than you realize. I'm doing everything I can to keep my son safe and secure. That means setting limits, even if it hurts. The line went dead. Margaret sat in the hush, her chest aching as she stared at the lifeless screen. She pressed her forehead against the cool wood of her nightstand, willing her heart to slow. For 2 years, ever since David's accident on that construction site, she had held her family together with nothing but determination and long hours. She had been the responsible one first, as the dutiful daughter, then as the diligent wife, and now as the sole provider for Timothy. Yet the people who should have supported her unconditionally had sided with Edward yet again. By mid-morning, Margaret forced herself to shake off the despair. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee, methodically preparing her notes for the day's client presentations. That afternoon, she drove to St. Mary's Elementary to pick up Timothy. As she rounded the corner near the school, she saw her son waiting at the curb, backpack strapped over both shoulders, hugging his favorite stuffed fox. Relief blossomed in her chest, overtaking the sharp pang in her heart. She knelt down to meet his gaze. Hey, buddy, she said, smoothing his wet hair. Did you have fun at school today? Timothy nodded, blinking bright blue eyes. It rained in art class, but I painted a rainbow. Do you want to see? Margaret ruffled his hair, forcing a smile. I'd love to see it, sweetheart. As they walked home under a shared umbrella, Margaret wrestled with her next steps. She knew her parents had mortgaged their house to fund Edward's scheme. If Secure Coin collapsed, as she was certain it would, they risked foreclosure. But she also recognized that if she pressed too hard, she might sever their last threads of connection to Timothy. She loved her son fiercely and felt gratitude that her local community neighbors, friends, even clients had rallied around them after David's death. yet in her parents' home. Timothy's well-being had taken a backseat to Edward's misadventures. That evening, as she prepared macaroni and cheese, Timothy's favorite, a small comfort amidst chaos, she decided it was time to establish firm boundaries. After dinner, she tucked Timothy into bed, smoothing his covers as he recounted the day's art projects. "Mom, are Grandma and Grandpa mad at you?" he asked suddenly, eyes wide and earnest. Margaret swallowed, her heart splitting between guilt and resolve. "They're upset with me, but not with you. They made a grown-up choice that wasn't right. But you're not at fault." He nodded thoughtfully, clutching his stuffed fox. "I'm glad you're my mom." Tears rose in her eyes. After brushing his hair from his forehead, she kissed his cheek and turned off the light. In the silence of his room, surrounded by faint moonlight, Margaret drafted an email to George and Barbara. She wrote, "Dear Mom and Dad, I understand your desire to help Edward, but I cannot condone their plan to risk the family home on a dubious investment. Effective immediately. 1. Timothy will not visit your house unless you agree to discuss Edward's situation without involving him. 2. I will not provide any more financial support for Edward if he wants investment advice. I'm happy to help him find legitimate opportunities. 3. If Secure Coin collapses, as it likely will, I will not bail out the mortgage. My priority is Timothy's stability. I love you both, but I won't allow our son to become collateral damage again. Love. Margaret." She hesitated before sending, her finger hovering over send. Then, with a determined exhale, she pressed the button. In that moment, she felt a weight lift, the weight of trying to please everyone and protect them from themselves. She would stand firm, even if it meant standing alone, because above all, she had a responsibility to her son, and that responsibility would never be compromised for another family's flawed sense of loyalty. After David's fatal accident 2 years ago, Margaret Johnson found herself navigating a solitude she had never anticipated. Overnight, the steadfast partnership she and David had built together, running a small graphic design studio, vanished in the blink of an eye. While she wrestled with the weight of his absence and raised 8-year-old Timothy alone, her parents, George and Barbara, offered only the bare minimum of support. They were present for obligatory holiday dinners and occasionally watched Timothy for an afternoon, but their engagement rarely went beyond quick hugs and polite inquiries. Any deeper emotional support felt out of reach, as if they'd tucked their compassion away to focus on something else, always on Edward's next venture. Margaret threw herself into the studio during the quiet hours, rising before sunrise to brew coffee and answer client emails from different time zones. By late afternoon, she would pause her work to drive across town for Timothy's pickup at Lincoln Elementary School. After helping him with homework, often a mixture of math and spelling worksheets, she would return to the office to finalize design mock-ups or prepare print-ready files for local businesses. Some evenings bled into early mornings as she balanced marketing proposals with bedtime stories. Each night, she would tuck Timothy under the covers, brushing a loose strand of hair from his forehead while he clung to his father's old baseball cap, the one David wore during weekend carpentry projects. "Mom, will Dad come back?" Timothy would ask, voice small and uncertain. Margaret tried to smile through her own heartbreak. "Dad's in our hearts, honey, but I'm here, and I love you. That will never change." Meanwhile, across town, in the Johnson family's modest ranch house, George and Barbara spent an alarming amount of time and money attempting to bail out Edward from yet another business failure. First, it was a food truck venture that lasted only 3 months before collapsing under mismanagement. Then came a revolutionary mobile app, which never made it past the concept stage, despite thousands of dollars pumped into its development. Their latest escapade involved flipping a rundown colonial in a neighboring suburb, a project that, instead of yielding profit, left Edward with mounting debts and the Johnsons' retirement savings draining away. Each time, Edward declined to acknowledge his mistakes. George and Barbara quietly opened their checkbook, wary of confronting their son's stubborn optimism. Margaret felt the sting of their choices acutely when she mentioned over the phone, late at night, while cradling an empty coffee mug, that Timothy had started having nightmares about his father, or that she was struggling to meet payroll. George would offer a perfunctory, "That's too bad," before reminding her that Edward's businesses were family too. Whenever Margaret suggested that her parents redirect even a fraction of their financial support toward Timothy's college fund or her own therapy, they brushed her concerns aside. "Your brother needs his chance," Barbara would say, her voice clipped. "You've done fine without us." On Thanksgiving Day, Margaret managed to carve out a few hours to visit her parents' home with Timothy, despite dreading the annual display of favoritism that had marked her childhood. The dining table was laid with a cedar-smoked turkey, mashed potatoes whipped with real butter, and cranberry sauce that sparkled like rubies. Yet the atmosphere felt hollow. As Margaret set a plate before her son, she glanced at the faded family portrait hanging above the mantel, her younger brother, Edward, smiling broadly while she stood off to the side, clutching a rolled-up scholarship certificate, when Margaret quietly told her mother that she was grateful for the meal. Barbara barely looked up, instead checking her phone for texts from Edward, who was supposedly scouting locations for his next guaranteed investment. Afterwards, as Margaret washed dishes in the cramped kitchen sink, George appeared, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture meant to convey support, but instead feeling more like a routine gesture devoid of warmth. "You know, Margaret," he said softly, "your brother is doing something special. We just want to help him see it through." Margaret didn't reply. All she could feel was exhaustion, physical, emotional, and moral, as she rinsed a plate stained with cranberry juice, the water swirling down the drain like her hopes of finding familial stability. That evening, back at her own home, Margaret and Timothy sat at their small kitchen table sharing canned soup and freshly baked bread. She read aloud from a Dr. Seuss book as he nibbled on a piece of bread, glancing occasionally at his wide-eyed mother. She dared not tell him how little support she could expect from her parents beyond occasional childcare or holiday invites. Instead, she squeezed his hand, determined to create a secure world for him, one built on genuine compassion rather than conditional affection. As the late evening news played softly on the television, reporting a foreclosure crisis in nearby neighborhoods, Margaret's gaze drifted to the margin of the screen. "Homes lost because owners took out mortgages they couldn't afford," the anchor said. Margaret shivered, picturing her parents' house. She had learned, sometimes painfully, that love alone couldn't pay the bills or heal a child's fear. But it could steel her resolve to protect Timothy at all costs, no matter how far their relationship with George and Barbara might fracture. In the quiet darkness before going to bed, Margaret jotted down a list of priorities. Keep the studio afloat, enroll Timothy in counseling to cope with his grief, and explore new ways to expand their chosen community of friends and neighbors who truly cared. As she pulled the blanket over her son's shoulders, she whispered, "We'll be all right. Tim, we have each other." He drifted to sleep, clutching his father's old cap, and Margaret lay awake a while longer, listening to the soft hum of the night. She knew the path ahead would be challenging, with her parents' misguided loyalty to Edward threatening to undermine her own sacrifices. But in that moment, she made a silent vow, no matter how drained she felt. She would find a way to give Timothy the unconditional support they both deserved, because, in the end, family could only thrive when love was freely given, not parceled out to the highest bidder. When Margaret Johnson invited her parents and Edward into attorney Patricia Hernandez's conference room, she felt a pang of uncertainty. Would they even show up? Yet, as they filed in one by one, Margaret steadied herself with the knowledge that truth, no matter how painful, was a necessary catalyst for healing. She opened her laptop to the emails she had received anonymously, clear evidence that Edward wasn't merely an investor in secure coin. He was actively recruiting new victims, including his own family. As her mother, Barbara, gasped at the evidence, and her father, George, leaned in with furrowed brows. The room crackled with tension. Edward's bravado crumbled as he tried to explain away the damning details, first insisting he was merely misinformed and then admitting, voice shaking, "I thought this would be my way out of the debt cycle." Margaret felt no satisfaction in his confession, only an overwhelming resolve to protect her son's future. When her father finally asked why she had shown them this information, she met his gaze directly. "I want you to understand that when I refused to give Edward money, I was trying to safeguard all of us," she said. The resulting silence spoke volumes. By the time the meeting ended, Edward was escorted out by FBI agents, and George and Barbara left without signing the agreement Margaret had drafted to protect Timothy, watching her parents walk away. Margaret felt an unexpected clarity. She had broken the cycle of enabling and set firm boundaries. Though the family she once knew was irreversibly changed, Margaret carried with her a renewed sense of purpose, one that placed love and emotional safety above all else. In life, we often confront the challenging reality that the people who are supposed to love and protect us may sometimes wound us instead. Yet, it is within these trials that we discover our true strength and clarity. Margaret's journey reminds us that setting healthy boundaries is not selfish. It is an act of self-preservation and love for those we hold dear. By refusing to let fear or guilt dictate her choices, she protected Timothy's emotional well-being and modeled resilience in the face of betrayal. Whether you're dealing with family conflict, financial pressure, or any circumstance that tests your faith in those closest to you, remember that it is always within your power to define what family truly means, often by surrounding yourself with people who show up unconditionally. If Margaret's story resonates with you, please share your experience in the comments below. How have you navigated difficult family dynamics? Your insight could provide comfort to others walking a similar path. And if you'd like to hear more real-life stories and valuable life lessons, don't forget to hit that subscribe to our button. Together, we can build a community grounded in empathy, support, and authentic connection.